We begin today the Gemara on Daf Samach Dalet Amar Aleph, 3 lines down from the top of the Amud. Amalei Ravine L'Ravashi, Samach Dalet Amar Aleph. Okay, so the Gemara before brought a statement from Rav Dimi. He says that when you sell a house and you don't specify what's included in the sale of that house, so you only are buying the house itself. The rights to dig below the house, to add a basement floor, or to do construction above is not included. Unless you add and you say that you're buying umke v'ruma. Now, umke means the depths and ruma means the height. And therefore, if you also want to acquire additional things, like to acquire the pit or a cistern, which is similar, as the Gemara will soon explain, then you have to add yet another lashon. You're going to have to say that you're buying from ara to haima, anything that's all the way down to the abyss. You have to add another lashon to include that as well. So, the Gemara over here is discussing this. There's a svara to say that maybe it doesn't work this way. When a person buys stam a house, you don't have to specify that you have rights to dig and below your house and to make a basement floor or to make construction above. There's a svara to say that that's automatically included. That's the discussion of the Gemara here.
Sometimes you see this even today, where you buy a building, but they tell you don't have air rights.
Right. Yeah.
Which means you can't go above.
Yeah, that could also be because of the
whatever. It's not lav davka.
The zoning, right? Yeah.
What's
the zoning? Yeah. Okay, let's see what the Gemara says. Amalei Ravina Ravashi. So Ravina says to Ravashi, Tashema. I'll bring you a raya to. Actually, this will be a raya against the point that Rav Dimi said. The Amar Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish said, and this was actually on the Gemara we learned yesterday on Daf Samach Gimel. There, the Gemara brought that when a person in a sale says extra language, it means that he's trying to say something here. With this, he's trying to keep something for himself. A seller. The Gemara before brought the case where a Levi sold a property to a Yisrael, and the Levi says that I want the Maisa to be mine. He means to leave over 1% of the property for himself. And based on that, Reish Lakish said, Zoyse Meres, we can apply and say similar also, Hamoicha Bayis L'Chaveiroi, a person sells a house to his friend, V'amaloi, and the seller says, Al Menas Shadiyuta Al Yene Shali, selling it to you, but on condition that the top floor, which really means the rooftop, is still mine. So then, if he adds that, the Yuta Yene Shali, that means that he can keep the rooftop for his own use. Because he added that, that's a condition to keep it for himself. Vamrinon, and the Gemara explained, Lamai Hilchase, what exactly is he keeping for himself on that rooftop by adding this condition. As the Gemara explained before, really the Mishnah said anytime you sell a house, you don't have the rights to the rooftop. What exactly did he mean to add over here when he said this, that he's keeping it for himself? Rav Zvid Amar, so Rav Zvid says, Shem Ratza Lahitzi Bazizin Maitzi, that the seller is retaining for himself the rights to put ledges that are going to stick out into the property, even though it's sticking out now into the property that the buyer owns now. But nevertheless, he's saying this in order to keep for himself that right. Rav Papa said something else. Shimratza livnei aliyah, that is al gaba baina, that if he wants to build another story on top of this rooftop, he's keeping for himself. The seller is keeping for himself the right to build another story on top of the roof. That's what he's keeping for himself when he adds and specifies al manas that the yutal yaina, that the rooftop is mine. Okay, that's what was explained about what Reish Lakish said. Now here, the Gemara is going to ask a question on what Rav Dimi said from what Rav Papa says. Now if you're going to say that when you sell a house and you don't specify anything, so then it's understood that the depths to be able to dig under the floor of your house or to go and build a story above it, the buyer doesn't acquire that. If you don't spell it out clearly, that you're selling him the rights to dig below and to build on top, he doesn't acquire that. That's the whole basis of what Rav Dimi said. If you're going to say that that's true, so then lamali amanas. Why do you have to make this condition here that I'm keeping that the seller makes a condition, I'm keeping the duta al yena for myself. Why does he have to make that condition? It's not included in the sale. According to what Rav Dimi said, when you sell a house and you don't specify clearly that I'm giving you the rights of umke v'ruma, which means to dig below and to build on top, it's not included. So why is it necessary to add this condition here that the yutal yaina will be mine? It is his. It's not included in the sale.
Isn't it that the buyer has to make the request? I want to
No,
buy this house.
no. Here we're
And
talking
I
about
won't.
the seller. Here we're talking about the seller that's making a special condition. The seller is the one that's
seller.
making the condition that I'm keeping the Dyuta al Yaina for me.
Yeah.
So Elamai, it's mashma from here, not like Rav Dimi, that when you sell a house, the depth to dig below and to build on top would be included in the sale. And therefore you have to make a special condition, and then, like Rav Papa's pshat is, when you make that condition, then you'll have the right to keep that right to build another story on the top. The seller will have that right. That's the raya against Rav Dimi. So the raya specifically from Rav Papa. So the Gemara answers, and this is really the pshat, the way we learned already yesterday on Papa. This is the way the Gemara explains it here. That al manasa hanile, that really over here the condition is that really we can still say like what Rav Dimi said, when you sell a house, then you don't specify, this buyer does not get the rights to build below or to build above. He doesn't get that rights. So why did he have to make this special condition? The seller owns the rooftop, but what happens if the house now collapses and you want to rebuild? If you're going to rebuild, the seller has the right to rebuild, and then the rooftop will still be his. If you don't make a special condition, if the house would collapse and they would have to rebuild, he would not get the right to the rooftop. So over here, the amanas, ahanile amanas, that is, the inofal hadabanila, that even if the house collapses and you're going to rebuild, even then the seller retains the rights, the ownership to the rooftop. That's why he was making that special condition. But even before he made the condition, he's not selling the rights to the rooftop. But now he's adding to say that even if it will collapse and it'll be rebuilt, it'll still be mine. This is the way we learned yesterday. That's the pshat of what Rav Papa is saying here. Okay. Next Mishnah is mamish a continuation to the first Mishnah. The first Mishnah started with the words of this Pedic. Hamoicher es habayis. A person sells a house. Okay, so Zok Dailig Mishnah, you're selling the house. Now, what's included in the sale, what's not included? So here the Mishnah says, Lo yasabar v'lo yasadus. A pit which is made to store water in it, or a dus, which is a cistern, also made to store water in it. Gemara will explain the difference. They're not included in the sale of the house. And that's even if you clearly specify that I'm selling you even what's in the depth and even what goes up in the height, still the bayit and the dus is not included. And if we're going to learn like Rav Dimi said, like we just finished learning here, that means that when you say the depth and the height, that means you have the rights to dig a basement floor or above in the roof, but not a bayit and dus. So now the bayit and dus is still owned by the seller. So if the seller wants to get to his pit of water that's there in this person's house, that's not included in the sale, how does he get there? He sold him the house. So the seller now, in order to get to his pit of water, he's going to have to buy from the buyer a pathway to have the rights to go there. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. That's Rabbi Akiva's opinion. However, Chachamim disagree. Chachamim say that the seller does not have to buy himself a pathway to get to his buyer. If he sells the house and he's keeping the pit of water for himself, so he's also keeping a pathway to that pit of water for himself as well. The Gemara is going to get into a whole discussion explaining the basis of the machlokes of Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. Now, Rabbi Akiva will agree to the Chachamim in the following case, in a case where the seller clearly says, Chutz me'elu, that I'm selling you the house besides the bayit and the dus. Why did he say that? Why did he add that? It's anyways not included in the kinyan. So the only reason he's adding that is because he wants to make it clear that he has a pathway. Then in such a case, he does not have to buy separately a pathway to get to his bayit. Another case where they argued, how about if the case was the opposite? He didn't sell his house. He only sold the pit of water in the house. So now the question is, the buyer buys this pit of water, but it was never specified that he's also selling him a pathway to get to that pit of water. So Rabbi Akiva says, the buyer does not have to separately pay for and buy a pathway to get to his pit. If he buys the pit, included in that acquisition is the pathway to get there. The Chachamim, however, say that the buyer does have to buy himself a pathway to get to his pit. Okay, so the Gemara starts first with explaining what's the difference between bayit and dus. Yosef Ravina v'kakashile. Ravina had a question about what it says here in the Mishnah. Hainu bayit and hainu dus. A bayit, a pit of water, and a dus, a cistern. It's the same thing. What's the difference between them? It's both places made to store water. Amalei Rava Tosfa Ravine. So Rava Tosfa answers Ravine, Tashema. Come and hear the answer to your question. It says in the Braisa the difference. The Tanya, the Braisa says, Echad haboir ve'echad hados bekarka. Both a pit and a dos, a cistern, dug inside the ground. What's the difference between them? Elash haboir b'chafira. A boir is that you dig in the ground, and it's an area where the ground is very hard, and in order to store water in it, you just dig inside that place, and it's stable enough that you can store water there. But vados is bibinyan. Dos is when you have the ground that you're digging in that's soft, and it's not stable enough that it will hold, and therefore in order to be able to store water there, you have to build a stone wall, you have to build something inside the ground in order to be able to store the water. So it's with a binyan, with stones. Now the Gemara says that the exact same discussion was between Rav Ashi as well. Yosef Rav Ashi v'kakashile. Rav Ashi was learning our Mishnah and he had the same question. Hainu boyer, hainu dus. That boyer and dus are the same thing. And Amalei Mark Shisha bereid Rav Chistel Rav Ashi Toshemat. He brought him the same brayso. The Tanya we learned echad haboyer ve'echad hadus bekarka. They're both inside the ground. Elish haboyer b'chafira. The boyer is when you dig. V'hados is bebigin. You have to build as well. So the Rashbam here explains that based on what the Gemara is saying, we could understand why the Mishnah had to mention both the boyer and the dos, that they're not included in the sale of the house. Because there would have been a svara to say that maybe the boyer, which is a pit in the ground, is not included, but a dos, which is built with stones, similar to the structure of a house that's built with stones, maybe that's included. So therefore it has to say that the dos is not included. On the other hand, if we would only say that the dos is not included, I would say maybe the dos, which is significant, it's built with stones properly, separately, that's like a whole structure for itself, and therefore it's not included in the sale. But maybe the boyer, which is not with stones separately, maybe it is included in the sale of the house. That's why I'd have to say both of these. Okay. Then the Mishnah said, the argument between the Chachamim and Rabbi Akiva, the tzarech likach lederech, in the case where he's selling the house and the boyer and dos are not included. So Rabbi Akiva says that the seller now has to buy himself from the buyer a pathway to get to his buyer. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. Chachamim say if you're not selling the buyer, so then you have a pathway to the buyer. That's understood that that the seller has a pathway. Does not have to separately buy a pathway for this. Zok the Gemara, my love, don't you think that the argument here between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim is based on the following idea? Rabbi Akiva's opinion is moicher ba'ayin yofa moicher. Whenever a person sells, he sells generously. He sells with a good eye. And therefore here as well, when you're selling this house, you're selling the house with every inch of the house. There's a bar that you're keeping for yourself. It's only the bar that you're keeping for yourself. But if you want to separately now have a pathway to get to that bar, you're going to have to buy it separately from the buyer. Because we understand we're maidach the das of a person that when he sells ba'ayin yofa. Rabbanan Sabri, however, Rabbanan's opinion is meicher ba'ayin ra meicher. When a person sells, he sells very stingy. He sells only specifically what is included in the sale, but what he needs still for himself, we will assume that he's keeping for himself more. He's keeping for himself what he needs. So in this case, when the seller needs a pathway to the buyer, we're going to assume that even if it wasn't specified, but if he's buying, if he's only selling the house and he's keeping the buyer for himself, that he's keeping the pathway to the buyer for himself. And the Gemara continues with the Ka'ama Nami Ba'alma, this that we say in other places as well, this rule, that Rabbi Akiva l'taimei, that Rabbi Akiva follows his reasoning. The Omar, Rabbi Akiva says, Meicher ba'ayin yofa meicher, that when a person sells, he sells generously. Where is this rule based from? Where does this come from? Mehacha. This is the source. It comes from this Mishnah. And so the Rashbam brings what we had earlier here in the Masechta on Daf Lamed Zayin. There, the Gemara discussed when a person buys 2 trees in a field, and he's not being sold the field itself. He's only buying 2 trees. So over there was an argument. What happens if the trees that he bought, after a while, they died? Does he have the rights not to replant the tree in that place or not? Rabbi Akiva says, yes. He didn't only buy the tree, but the owner sold him the right to replant another tree in that place, because he sold him ba'ayin yofa in that spot that he has the right to plant another tree. But the Chachamim disagreed. The Chachamim said, no, you didn't buy the field, you just bought the tree. You bought only this tree, and when this tree dies, you can't plant another tree. Why? Because he sold him ba'ayin ra. He only sold him this tree and not anything more. So that machlekes of ayin yafa or ayin ra, what's the source of it? Right over here. Benegay to the pathway to a boyer and a dus. Rabbi Akiva says that you don't have a pathway, and the Chachamim say that you do have the pathway. Okay, so the Gemara says
if Rabbi Akiva says that you don't have a pathway, that's not.
that's the Ayin Ra. So
that's Ayin Ra.
did I confuse opinions, Paul? Maybe I did. So Rabbi Akiva is the one that holds that it's Ba'ayin Ra, correct? One second. Ayin Yafa, fakat, Ayin Yafa.
The Meicher is Ayin Yafa.
Yeah, okay.
For the seller, it's bad, but for the Meicher, it's
Right,
the
correct. He's Adarabah, he's selling you more. If you say he doesn't have the pathway, that's Ayin Yafa, meaning that he's giving the buyer more. Okay. Right. Okay, so now the Gemara answers, no, it's not necessarily the explanation for this machlokes here. So the Gemara, Dilme, we can say that here there's a different explanation. That Rabbi Akiva saw, that Rabbi adds Baha Pligi, they argue in the following point. Rabbi Akiva Savar, when it comes to the pathway, Rabbi Akiva has a svara that applies specifically regarding this pathway. Ein adam roitze sheyitin ma'isov v'yidrasu acherim. A person is not paying for a house, and he's paying for it, and the seller still retains rights to walk through my house. If I'm buying the house, this house is mine. True, the buyer, the pit where the water is being stored is not mine, but every time he's going to want to get water over here, he's going to have to knock on the door and wait until I'm ready for him to come in. He doesn't just have a pathway to walk through. The Rabbanan say, specifically in this case, this is Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva specifically say that in this case, that there's a svara that the buyer of the house doesn't want people to just walk through. But the Rabbanan actually say that the logic goes the other way. The person doesn't want to take money, and then that would force him now that he has a bird that he owns in this house, and the only way he can get there is to fly in the air. He doesn't have a pathway even to get there. He owns the bird that has water in this house. How's he going to get there? He's going to have to fly in the air. So it's understood that when the seller sold, and there's a bird in this house, that it's understood that he has the rights to go there. Punkt verkehrt. Otherwise, how is he going to get to his bird? So this is a svara that applies specifically to this case with a buyer that is in the middle of a house that you're selling to someone. That doesn't apply to other cases. For example, what we said, the example I mentioned before regarding, it's in the house, yeah. For example, the case of the case of a tree that I mentioned before, of these svaras don't apply. So it's specifically a svar over here regarding this case. So says the Gemara ve'elo, maybe we could say, let's look at what they said further in the Mishnah, in the Sefer. Miseifer. What did it say in the Sefer of the Mishnah? Machran la'acher. When a person is selling only the bar to someone. Adarabah, the seller is keeping the house for himself and he's selling only the bar. So over here, Rabbi Akiva said, the buyer does not have to acquire a pathway to the bar for himself. And the Chachamim say that you do. So over here, in this case, you can't apply the logic the way it was in the Reisha, because here they're saying, yeah, exactly. Over here, it comes out the exact opposite. So over here, the only way to explain this is to go back to the svara that we said before, that we're going to have to say that Rabbi Akiva has a general shitta, that whenever you sell, you're selling ba'ayin yafeh. So in the case where you're selling only the buyer, you're selling to the buyer ba'ayin yafeh, that he should have a way how to get to his buyer. And Chachamim say you're selling ba'ayin ra. So the only thing that you're selling is just a buyer. So you're going to want to have a pathway to get there, you're going to have to buy that separately. That's what it seems. That's the only way to explain what the Sefer says.
So in the case of the Ayin Ra, the seller would have to say, I'm selling you the bar, and you have to buy this to get to it.
You don't even have to specify it. It's self-understood. That's the way it works with every sale. If you're buying the buyer, so then you're going to have to buy separately the way to get there. Okay. Yeah? But the Gemara here says, even regarding the Sefer, I can tell you that there's a different explanation here for the Sefer. Dilme, I can still say that Bahai Pligi. That this is the argument here in the Sefer. The Rabbi Akiva's opinion is, anytime you have a situation like this, where there's an argument between the Meicher and the Lekeach, what was meant to be included over here in the sale, Basa daite the Lekeach as linan. You follow the das of the Lekeach. The Lekeach is the one that has the upper hand in this sale, because the Lekeach is the one that's paying for this. So a Lekeach is not going to pay for something if he doesn't have a way how to get there. He doesn't have access. So therefore, it's mistaver that the Lekeich's approach to say that what he bought included a pathway is correct. But Rabbanan Savri, however, Rabbanan's opinion is Basadai the Meicher as Lina, that no, we follow the das of the Meicher, and the reason is because the Lekeach wants to be Maitzi. The Lekeach wants to take something from this Meicher. Whenever you have a suffix who something belongs to, the halacha always is you're the buyer. If you want to be Maitzi something from the Lekeach, from the Meicha, that is, bring a raya that was included in your acquisition. So therefore, when there's an argument like this, so we're going to follow the opinion of the Meicha that says that it was not included. It's not part of the sale. So that's also, again, a svara specifically that applies in this kind of case where it's not clear what was included in the sale. So over here, you say that you follow there's a machlokes, whether you follow the das of the meicher, whether you follow the das of leikech. Was he giving him access to what he has acquired, or was he not giving him access? So that's a machlokes of it. But it's not based on the concept of ayin yafe, ayin ra, whether a person sells generously or a person sells with a stingy attitude. It's a different svara. So says the Gemara ve'elo. So from here we can't bring a raya to this concept of ayin yafe, ayin ra, but maybe meha. I'll bring you a raya from what it says in a Mishnah further here in this page. Here, the next Mishnah, the Gemara discusses. In fact, it's not mamish the next Mishnah, but it's a Mishnah here further in the Pedic where it discusses a person that's selling a field, not a house. And that there the Mishnah says when you sell a field, loyas a pit of water is not included in the sale. V'loyas a gas, if you have a wine press there, it's not included either. V'loyas a shoivech, a dovkat is also not included. Ben charevim ben yeshuvim, whether they're dry, whether this pit is empty, there's no water in it, or whether it's full of water, it's not included. And v'tzarach likach le'derech, you're gonna have to, the buyer is gonna have to buy himself a pathway, or sorry, again, that's going to the seller, that is. The seller is going to have to buy himself a pathway to this buyer that he still owns in this property. Divrei Rabbi Akiva, that's Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Basically the same, like Rabbi Akiva said in a house. When you sell a house and you're keeping the buyer, the seller is keeping the buyer for himself, he has to buy himself a pathway to that buyer. The same is here regarding a field that's being sold and the seller keeps the buyer for himself. However, Chachamim say, Ein tzarich. The seller does not have to buy a pathway for himself. So now the question is, Ha su lamali. Why is the Mishnah later saying basically the exact same argument between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim regarding a field, whether the seller has to buy himself a pathway? So elalav, don't you think that it's repeating it and it's saying it here again to let me know that this is a general rule? La hokamashma. This is what it's coming to say. The Rabbi Akiva Sovar, Rabbi Akiva's opinion is meicher buying yafa meicher. When you sell, you're selling generously with a good eye. And therefore, even over here in this case, by the field, it's letting you know a general halacha that the buyer gets the whole entire field, and the seller is going to have to separately buy from him a pathway. But that you sell with a bad eye, with a stingy eye, and therefore the seller is not going to have to buy himself separately away to his buyer that he still owns. That's the only way to explain the reason why it's repeating this regarding a sada. Says the Gemara, not necessarily. Maybe I could say, let's go back to the svaras that we spoke about before. That maybe by the pathway to a pit of water, there's a specific svara that we already explained before. That over here I could say that there's a svara that we say that, how is he going to get to the buyer? If he's keeping it for himself, he obviously has to have a pathway to get there. Or on the other hand, there's a svara that he says that the buyer doesn't want anybody to walk through his house. If I'm buying a house, I don't want people just walking through my house, which is a private place. So now the Gemara says maybe it's really based on those svaras that we mentioned before, not the svara of ayin yafa, ayin ra. Now why is it repeated again regarding a sada, regarding a field? Because v'dilma, maybe I can say ashminam bayis. One Mishnah is telling me how those svaras apply in a house, and then the kamashmal on sada, and then the Mishnah later it tells us how that applies regarding a sada. And it's necessary to say the halacha both regarding a house and regarding outdoors, regarding a field. Because the Yashmin and bias, if we would only say the halacha of what Rabbi Akiva said regarding a bias, that when a person buys, he doesn't want anyone walking through his house. I would say maybe that's only in a house. Mishum the boitz niyusa, because a house needs privacy. It's inside your private house. Over here, I would say that there, Rabbi Akiva said that the buyer does not want to allow the seller to have rights to walk through his house. But maybe that doesn't apply in a field. Outdoors in a field, over there, it's not a place of privacy. Maybe there, Rabbi Akiva would agree that the seller has his rights to walk through. On the other hand, in a field, I would say not. And on the other hand, via Shmin and Sadeh, if the Mishnah would say, only the Mishnah that says later, that in a field, the seller does not have the rights to walk into the field to the pit of water. He's going to have to buy it separately. I would say maybe there the reason is because in a field you have things growing there. And you're going to step over the things that the buyer planted there. So that's something that bothers the buyer much more than a house. In a house, you're not stepping over his plants. So maybe I would say that only out in the field you don't have a pathway. But maybe in a house where there's nothing planted, maybe over there Rabbi Kiva would agree that the seller gets a pathway automatically. So therefore I have to say separately the svara for the house and for the field. Says the Gemara, Ella, there's yet another case there in that Mishnah where it discusses the Sadeh. So over there it also says, Miseifer, in the Seifer of that Mishnah, it says similar to the halacha that we had over here regarding the house, Machran la'acher. If in your field, you're only selling the pit of water or the cistern of the water in the field. So over here, Rabbi Kiva says, the buyer does not have to buy himself a pathway to this pit that he bought. And the Chachamim say that you do have to buy. So the question is, Hasul Amali, why is it yet saying this case again? We already understand from the Reish of the Mishnah that speaks about the Sadeh, and the Mishnah before that spoke about the bias, where we have these svaras, the svara of whether a person should have the rights to the pathway, whether he should not have the rights to the pathway. And we already explained all the svaras that applies both to a bias, where there's a case of he wants the tznius, he wants the privacy, and how it applies to a Sadeh, where a person is afraid that you're going to step over his plans. So we already have all the details explained about this idea. So now why is it saying yet this case again regarding a case where you sold only a pit in your field to someone, whether the buyer has a pathway or not? The only way to explain why it's elalav, the only way to explain why it's adding yet another case is because kamash malon, it's coming to tell me that it's not only based on the svaris we said that relate specifically to a pathway that you have or you need by a pit, but rather it's a more general rule that there's an argument here. That Rabbi Kiva holds that when a person sells, he sells with a generous and with a good eye, and therefore the buyer gets the property. So in all cases over here, you always go but for the benefit of the buyer. You always say that the seller is selling generously. And so it applies in both cases the way the Mishnah said it. And whenever a person sells, he's always selling with a bad eye, he's always selling stingy. In either case, the buyer is going to have the lower hand. The seller is the one that has the upper hand to keep the pathway for himself, or that the buyer would have to buy a pathway for himself if he only bought the buyer. This is the raya. The fact that the Mishnah repeated this case yet again is the raya that there's a general machlekes here between Rabbi Kiva and the Chachamim regarding every sale, whether a seller sells ba'ayin yafa or ba'ayin ra. Let's just see the continuation here where the Gemara says the psak din lahalacha. Itmar, so we learned Ravuna Amarav. Ravuna said in the name of Rav regarding this machlekes that we just finished explaining, whether you sell ba'ayin yafa or you sell ba'ayin ra, regarding any kind of sale, halacha kedivrei Chachamim. We paskin like the Chachamim that when a person sells, he sells ba'ayin ra, that is. When do you say that a person gives ba'ayin yafa? That's when you're giving a gift. When you give a gift and there's a suffix what you gave, a matana kol noisin, I say ba'ayin yafa noisin. But if it's a sale and you're getting paid money, so then you're stingy. Then you're only selling specifically what the money was for, but everything else you want to keep for yourself. So we paskin like the Chachamim. But Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Shmuel halacha kerabba Kiva. But however, he said in the name of Shmuel that he paskened like Rabbi Kiva, that even by a sale, a person is selling generously. Amalei Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Rav Huna. Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba said to Rav Huna, that said in the name of Rav that the halacha is like the Chachamim. But vazimnin sagiin many times amrita kamei Rav hilchas kerabba Kiva. I said in front of Rav many times that the halacha is like Rabbi Kiva, and he didn't comment to me. How could you say that Rav paskened like the Chachamim if I said in front of Rav many times that the halacha is like Rabbi Kiva? Amalei, so he said to him, Heichi tenisua. How did you learn? What did you say is Rabbi Kiva's opinion? Amalei ipchatanina. I actually said the opposite. That Rabbi Kiva was the one that held that when you sell, you're selling ba'ayin ra. So he said to him, okay, so that's understood. That's why I didn't comment to you when you said the halacha is like Rabbi Kiva, because you quoted Rabbi Kiva's opinion as the one that holds that the one that sells ba'ayin ra, and that's how the Rav paskin, and therefore he says over here we said that he paskin like the Chachamim. The Chachamim are the ones that hold that when you sell ba'ayin ra.